December 7th, 1941. 07:55 hours. USS West Virginia, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller was in the middle of his least favorite duty, collecting dirty laundry from officers' quarters. Sunday morning. Most of the crew were either sleeping in or had gone ashore on Liberty the night before. Miller and the other black sailors in the steward's branch were working, as always, gathering linens, preparing to serve breakfast, performing the endless maintenance tasks that kept the ship's living quarters clean and orderly. This was what the United States Navy allowed black men to do in 1941. Cook food, shine shoes, serve officers, clean quarters. No matter how intelligent you were, no matter how physically capable, no matter what skills you possessed, if you were black, you were a messman. Miller was big, 6'3", 220 pounds of farm boy muscle from Waco, Texas. He was the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, a title he'd defended successfully multiple times. White sailors who wouldn't eat at the same table with him would cheer him in the boxing ring. The contradiction wasn't lost on Miller. They'd watch him fight for entertainment, but wouldn't let him fight for his country. As he moved through the officers' wardroom gathering dirty laundry, he heard aircraft engines overhead. Low, unusually low. Through the porthole, he glimpsed planes with distinctive red circles painted on their wings. Japanese markings. His first thought was that this had to be some kind of exercise, a drill they hadn't been informed about, because the alternative, that Japanese aircraft were actually attacking Pearl Harbor, seemed impossible. Everyone knew Hawaii was too far from Japan for a carrier strike. Everyone knew the Japanese wouldn't dare attack American territory. Everyone knew the Pacific Fleet was safe in Pearl Harbor. Everyone was wrong. The first bomb exploded somewhere forward. The deck lurched beneath Miller's feet. The lights flickered and died. Emergency klaxons began their urgent wail throughout the ship. Miller dropped the laundry and ran toward his battle station, the ammunition magazine deep in the ship's hull, where he was assigned to pass shells up to the gun crews. It was one of the few combat-adjacent duties the Navy allowed black sailors to perform. He never made it. A Japanese torpedo, one of several that would strike West Virginia, tore through the port side with catastrophic force. The explosion ripped a hole 25 feet wide in the battleship's hull. Seawater flooded in with tremendous force. Damage control parties sealed compartments to prevent the entire ship from sinking, but those seals trapped men below decks. The ammunition magazine, Miller's battle station, was cut off, unreachable, flooded. Miller stood in a passageway as water rose around his ankles, then his knees, with no orders, no assignment, and no idea what to do. Around him, the ship was dying. Men were screaming. Steel was groaning under impossible stress. The carefully rehearsed battle plans had dissolved into chaos within seconds of the first attack. This was the moment when everything changed. Miller could have sought shelter, could have abandoned ship, could have followed the stream of sailors evacuating to safety. Nobody would have blamed him. He had no combat assignment anymore, no role to play in the ship's defense. Instead, he ran toward the sound of gunfire, toward the bridge, toward the chaos, toward the one place where he might be able to help. For the next 20 minutes, Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller would operate an anti-aircraft gun he'd never been trained to use, firing at Japanese aircraft while officers and sailors died around him. He would help carry wounded men to safety, including the ship's mortally wounded captain. He would continue fighting until physically ordered to abandon ship. And when it was over, when the smoke cleared and America counted its dead, the United States Navy would face an impossible question. How do you acknowledge extraordinary heroism from a man you've spent decades insisting was unfit for combat duty because of the color of his skin?
This is the story of 15 minutes that turned a messman into a legend. This is the story of the first Black American naval hero and how the Navy spent 2 years trying to figure out what to do about him. This is the story of Dorie Miller, the man who fought back when his country was attacked, even though his country wouldn't let him be a warrior. To understand what Dorie Miller accomplished on December 7, 1941, you have to understand what the United States Navy wouldn't let him do. Doris Miller, he hated the name Doris, insisted everyone call him Dorie, was born on October 12, 1919, in Waco, Texas. He was the third of 4 sons born to Connery and Henrietta Miller, sharecroppers working land in the Jim Crow South that they would never own. The Millers were poor, but they weren't broken. Connery worked himself to exhaustion on other men's land. Henrietta took in laundry and raised vegetables. The boys picked cotton when they weren't in school. It was hard, grinding poverty, but it was survival. Dorie was bigger than his brothers, stronger. By the time he reached high school, he was a force on the football field, a fullback who ran through opposing lines like they were made of air. He worked farm labor that would break most grown men. He had the kind of physical presence that demanded attention. But this was Texas in the 1930s. A black boy, no matter how capable, had limited options: sharecropping, manual labor, service work. The doors that opened for white boys his age, college, professional careers, opportunity, were locked shut for Black Americans. In 1938, facing a future of cotton fields and back-breaking labor, 19-year-old Dorie Miller made a decision. He walked into the Navy recruiting office in Waco and enlisted. The recruiter was friendly enough, told Miller about seeing the world, learning skills, and serving his country. What the recruiter didn't mention, what Miller would discover soon enough, was that the United States Navy had a policy regarding black sailors that was explicit, absolute, and degrading. General Order 99, dating back to 1893, was clear. Negroes may be enlisted in the messman branch only. Not suggested, not recommended, required. By official Navy policy, black men could only serve as messmen, cooks, stewards, servants to white officers, no matter their intelligence, no matter their aptitude test scores, no matter their desire to serve in combat roles. The reasoning, documented in Navy personnel manuals and training materials, was presented as biological fact. Members of the Negro race lack the mental capacity, technical aptitude, and emotional stability required for complex military operations. They are, however, naturally suited for service positions requiring manual labor and personal service. It was scientific racism, dressed up in official language, enforced without exception throughout the Navy. When Miller completed basic training at Naval Training Station Norfolk in Virginia, he expected to receive specialized training in some technical field. He'd scored well on aptitude tests. He was mechanically inclined, good with his hands, quick to learn. Instead, he was sent to mess attendant school, where he learned to serve meals properly, clean officers' quarters to inspection standards, polish shoes, make beds with hospital corners, iron uniforms, wait tables. These were the only skills the United States Navy would teach a black man in 1939. In January 1940, Miller was assigned to the USS West Virginia, a Colorado-class battleship that represented the peak of American naval power. The WV was 624 feet long, displaced 32,600 tons, and mounted 8 massive 16-inch guns that could hurl 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles. It was one of the most powerful warships in the world, and Dorie Miller's job was to serve breakfast to its officers. His daily routine aboard ship was mind-numbing in its repetition. 0500, wake up, prepare officers' breakfast. 0630, serve breakfast in wardroom. 0800, clean officers' staterooms. 1000, prepare lunch. 1100, serve lunch. 1300, laundry and linen service. 1600, prepare dinner. 1700, serve dinner. 1900, clean galley and wardroom. 2000, free time if no additional duties required. Day after day, week after week, year after year. This was military service for black sailors in the United States Navy. Not defending the ship, not operating weapons, not standing watch on the bridge, just cooking, cleaning, and serving. Miller endured it the way thousands of other black sailors endured it, by taking pride in doing even menial work with excellence, by building brotherhood with fellow black sailors who understood the struggle, and by finding the one outlet where he could compete on equal terms, boxing. He became the ship's heavyweight champion in 1940, defeating all challengers. In the boxing ring, skin color didn't matter. Skill mattered. Strength mattered. My heart mattered. White sailors, who wouldn't sit beside him in the mess hall, would cheer him when he fought. Officers who called him boy would shake his hand after victories. The contradiction was obvious and bitter. "They don't mind watching me fight for their entertainment," Miller told a fellow messman after one bout, "but they won't let me fight for my country. They'll cheer me for knocking out a white sailor in the ring, but they won't trust me to load ammunition in a gun." Still, Miller was professional. He showed up on time. He did his assigned duties without complaint. He kept his frustrations private. In the Navy's official records, he was an exemplary messman. No disciplinary problems, consistently positive performance reviews, exactly the kind of black sailor the Navy wanted to point to as proof the segregation system worked. What those records couldn't capture was Miller's internal frustration, his awareness that he was capable of so much more than carrying trays, his understanding that the only thing preventing him from serving in meaningful combat roles was systematic racism embedded in Navy policy. And those records certainly couldn't predict what would happen when Japanese bombs shattered the carefully maintained fiction that black sailors were unfit for combat duty. 0802 hours, USS West Virginia, under attack. Miller reached the area near the ship's bridge to find a scene of absolute devastation. The bridge superstructure, normally a precisely organized command center where officers controlled the ship, had been torn apart by Japanese strafing fire and bomb fragments. Windows were shattered, equipment was destroyed, blood was everywhere.
and Captain Mervyn Bennion, the ship's commanding officer, was dying on the deck. A bomb fragment, a piece of shrapnel from a near-miss explosion, had torn through Bennion's abdomen, causing massive internal injuries. He was conscious but in shock, trying to give orders despite trauma that would kill him within minutes. Blood pooled beneath him as he clutched his midsection, refusing to leave his post even as life drained away. Miller's training as a messman hadn't prepared him for this. Nobody had taught him battlefield medicine. Nobody had taught him how to respond when the commanding officer was dying and the ship was under sustained attack. Nobody had trained him for anything except serving food. But Miller didn't need training to recognize that wounded men needed help. Lieutenant Frederick White, the ship's communication officer, was trying to move the captain to a safer location. Bennion was a big, heavy man, and White couldn't manage it alone. Miller stepped forward without being asked. Together, they lifted Captain Bennion and began carrying him away from the most exposed area of the bridge. Japanese aircraft continued making strafing runs, their machine guns tearing through metal bulkheads, ricocheting off steel surfaces, killing and wounding men throughout the superstructure. Bullets chewed through equipment around them. Explosions sent shrapnel screaming through the air. Men were falling, dying, bleeding. The carefully rehearsed battle plans had completely dissolved. Miller and White got Bennion to a position with more overhead cover. The captain would die shortly afterwards from his wounds. They were too severe for any battlefield treatment, but they'd given him what shelter they could in his final minutes. Miller looked around, trying to make sense of the chaos. The ship was listing heavily to port, flooding from multiple torpedo hits. Fires were breaking out throughout the vessel. Men were trapped below decks, drowning in compartments sealed to prevent complete sinking. The ammunition magazine, Miller's official battle station, was unreachable and probably flooded. He had no assignment, no orders, no role in the battle plan. Then he saw the guns. The USS West Virginia mounted 8 .50 caliber Browning machine guns arranged in 4 twin mounts for anti-aircraft defense. These were serious weapons. Each gun fired 750 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, with an effective range of 2,000 yards. They could tear apart aircraft with concentrated fire, and most of them were unmanned. The sailors trained to operate these guns, all white men, because the Navy didn't train black sailors on weapons, were dead, wounded, or trapped below decks. The guns sat silent while Japanese aircraft made repeated attack runs, bombing and strafing with impunity.
Miller had never fired a .50 caliber machine gun. He'd never received any weapons training beyond basic familiarization with a sidearm. He'd certainly never been taught anti-aircraft gunnery, the complex art of leading fast-moving targets, coordinating fire with other gunners, managing ammunition feeds. But the guns were there, the Japanese were there, and American sailors were dying. Lieutenant Frederick White, who would later provide crucial testimony about Miller's actions, saw Miller looking at one of the unmanned gun mounts. At that moment, with the ship dying and Japanese aircraft everywhere, formal Navy policy about who could and couldn't operate weapons seemed absurdly irrelevant. "Miller, can you handle that gun?" White asked. It wasn't really a question. It was permission. Authorization to do what the Navy had spent years insisting black men couldn't do. "I'll do my best, sir," Miller replied. He climbed into the gun mount, a twin .50 caliber setup with 2 heavy machine guns side by side. The weapons were completely unfamiliar. He'd never touched these controls, never charged these weapons, never practiced the manual of arms. But Miller was mechanically inclined. The basic operation was intuitive. Ammunition belt feeds into receiver, charging handles prepare weapons for firing, butterfly triggers between the grips fire the guns. Traverse and elevation wheels aim the mount. He'd watched gun crews during drills, seen them practice, absorbed the procedures through observation, even though he'd never been allowed to participate. Now he would put that observation to use. A Japanese B-5N Kate torpedo bomber swept low across the harbor, having just released its payload at another battleship. Miller tracked it with the gun mount, swinging the barrels to lead the target, and pressed the firing buttons. The twin .50 calibers roared to life. The recoil was tremendous, 1,500 rounds per minute combined from both guns, each round pushing back against the mount. The noise was deafening. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, a stream of fire reaching toward the Japanese aircraft. He didn't know if he hit it. In the chaos, with dozens of aircraft filling the sky and explosions everywhere, tracking individual targets was impossible. But he kept firing, swinging the mount from target to target, burning through ammunition at a prodigious rate. An A6M-0 fighter made a strafing run across Battleship Row. Miller tracked it, fired a long burst. The Zero pulled up sharply, either hit or evading. More aircraft appeared. The Japanese were attacking in waves, coordinated strikes designed to maximize destruction. Miller kept firing, his hands working the controls with increasing confidence, his mechanical aptitude overcoming his lack of formal training. The gun barrels began to glow red from sustained fire. The heat was intense. Miller could feel it through his uniform. Spent shell casings piled up around the mount. The ammunition belt feeding system required constant attention to prevent jams, and Miller kept firing. For approximately 15 minutes, though time became elastic in combat and survivors' estimates varied, Miller manned that gun mount, providing anti-aircraft fire while the USS West Virginia was dying beneath him. Around him, the ship was in its death throes. More torpedoes struck, more fires broke out. The list to port increased dramatically as flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. Men were abandoning the ship, some jumping into water thick with burning oil. But Miller kept firing until the ammunition was completely exhausted and the guns fell silent, barrels glowing cherry red in the smoke. Only then did he leave the gun mount. Lieutenant Commander Dorr C. Johnson, the senior surviving officer, was organizing evacuation. The USS West Virginia was going down, not sinking completely, but settling onto the harbor bottom at a severe list. Staying aboard meant risking being trapped when the ship rolled further. Miller helped evacuate wounded sailors, assisting men who couldn't move on their own. He helped fight fires, using portable extinguishers against blazes that threatened to reach ammunition stores. He continued working until Johnson specifically ordered him to abandon ship. Miller was among the last men to leave West Virginia. He climbed down lines into water that was covered with burning oil, then swam to Ford Island through debris and bodies. Behind him, the USS West Virginia settled on to the harbor bottom, listing 28 degrees to port. Of the 1,541 men aboard that morning, 106 were dead. Another 52 were wounded. The ship itself would rest on the bottom for months before being refloated and eventually returned to service. And Dorie Miller, mess attendant second class, had fought to defend it with everything he had.
December 8, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The day after the attack, as the Navy began the massive task of assessing damage and accounting for casualties, reports started filtering up through the chain of command about something unusual. Multiple officers had witnessed Mess Attendant Miller's actions in West Virginia. Lieutenant Frederick White submitted an official report describing how Miller had helped move the mortally wounded captain and then operated an anti-aircraft gun with competence and courage. Other survivors corroborated the account. Yes, they'd seen the ship's messman, the big guy, the boxing champion, manning one of the .50 caliber mounts. Yes, he'd fired continuously throughout the attack. Yes, he'd performed admirably under fire. The Navy had a problem. Acknowledging Miller's heroism meant acknowledging that a black sailor with zero weapons training had successfully operated anti-aircraft guns during combat. It meant acknowledging that he'd performed a combat role competently, courageously, effectively. And that acknowledgement threatened the entire foundation of Navy segregation policy. If one black messman could operate guns effectively, why were black sailors restricted to the messman branch? If they could fight bravely under fire, why weren't they allowed in combat roles? If an untrained black sailor could learn weapons operation through simple observation, what could properly trained black sailors accomplish? These were questions the Navy desperately didn't want to answer. So initially, they did what they'd always done with uncomfortable truths about black capability. They ignored the situation. Official after-action reports from Pearl Harbor mentioned crew members manning guns and fighting fires. They didn't mention specific names. They certainly didn't mention that one of the most noteworthy individual actions had been performed by a messman. Miller was reassigned to the USS Indianapolis. The West Virginia would be under repair for years, and went back to his regular duties, serving food, cleaning quarters, as if December 7th had never happened. But the story was already spreading through unofficial channels. Black sailors stationed at Pearl Harbor knew what Miller had done. They told shipmates. The story spread through the segregated mess decks, through the black community in Honolulu, through the network of black sailors stationed across the Pacific, and it reached the black press back in the United States. Black newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and the Baltimore Afro-American had reporters who specifically covered black military service. They had sources throughout the military who fed them stories the white press ignored. By January 1942, these papers were asking pointed questions. Who was the black sailor who'd manned guns at Pearl Harbor? What was his name? Why wasn't the Navy acknowledging him? The Pittsburgh Courier launched an active investigation, interviewing Pearl Harbor survivors, collecting testimony, piecing together the story. On March 14, 1942, more than 3 months after the attack, they broke the story nationwide with a front-page headline, "Messman Hero of Pearl Harbor." The article identified Doris Miller by name. It described his actions in detail, helping the wounded captain, manning the anti-aircraft gun for 15 minutes, continuing to fight until ordered to abandon ship, and asked the uncomfortable question, why had the Navy remained silent about this extraordinary heroism? The story caught fire in black communities across America. Here was proof, undeniable, witnessed by multiple officers, documented in official reports, that black men could fight, could operate complex weapons, and could display courage equal to any white sailor. And the Navy had been hiding it. Letters poured into Navy headquarters. Civil rights organizations demanded recognition. Black newspapers ran follow-up articles asking whether the Navy was deliberately suppressing the story because acknowledging black heroism would undermine segregation policy. the pressure became impossible to ignore. The Navy, backed into a corner by public outcry and undeniable evidence, had to respond. They couldn't deny what had happened, too many witnesses, too much documentation. They couldn't ignore it. The story was too widespread, the pressure too intense. So they did the minimum necessary to acknowledge Miller's heroism while trying to limit its implications for broader Navy policy. April 1, 1942, Navy Department announcement. The United States Navy announced that Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller would receive the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest decoration for valor, behind only the Medal of Honor. It was unprecedented. No black sailor had ever received the Navy Cross. The Navy was officially acknowledging extraordinary heroism from a man they'd relegated to serving food.
The official citation emphasized Miller's distinguished devotion to duty and extraordinary courage. It mentioned his assistance in moving the wounded captain. It acknowledged he'd manned and operated a machine gun. What it didn't mention, how long he'd fired the weapon, 15 minutes of sustained fire. How effectively he'd operated an unfamiliar weapon system. How many enemy aircraft he'd engaged. That he'd done all this with absolutely zero formal training. The citation made it sound like Miller had fired a few shots before being ordered away from the gun. The reality that he'd provided sustained anti-aircraft fire throughout the attack, operating a weapon he'd never been trained on, was carefully understated. There was another detail that would only emerge decades later, hidden in archived paperwork. Miller had originally been recommended for the Medal of Honor, not the Navy Cross. Lieutenant Commander Dorie C. Johnson, the senior surviving officer from West Virginia, had submitted a Medal of Honor recommendation in December 1941. His justification was clear. Miller's actions met the criteria for the nation's highest military decoration: extraordinary heroism, devotion to duty beyond the call, actions that saved lives. That recommendation had been downgraded to a Navy Cross somewhere in the chain of command. The official reasoning was never documented, but the pattern was obvious. In 1942, the Navy wasn't prepared to give the Medal of Honor to a black messman, regardless of what he'd done. The Navy Cross would have to be enough. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally presented the Navy Cross to Dorie Miller aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. The ceremony was extensively photographed. The Navy made sure of that. They needed to demonstrate they were acknowledging black heroism, needed images for distribution to newspapers, including black publications that had been demanding Miller's recognition. Miller stood at rigid attention in his dress whites, while Admiral Nimitz pinned the medal to his chest. Nimitz, to his credit, seemed genuinely moved by the occasion. This marks the first time in this conflict that such a high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, Nimitz said during the ceremony, his voice carrying across the carrier's deck. That phrase hung in the air with an uncomfortable weight. Not to a sailor, not to a hero, to a member of his race. The message, intentional or not, was clear.
Miller was exceptional for a black sailor, not simply exceptional as a sailor. His heroism was being acknowledged, but within a framework that maintained racial hierarchy. After the ceremony, the Navy dispatched Miller on a war bond tour across the United States. They recognized the propaganda value. A genuine hero, a black sailor who'd fought back at Pearl Harbor, could encourage black enlistment and boost war bond sales in black communities. For 3 months, Miller traveled from city to city, primarily visiting black neighborhoods and communities. He gave speeches, carefully scripted by Navy public affairs officers, describing his experience at Pearl Harbor and encouraging black Americans to support the war effort through enlistment and war bond purchases. The tours were remarkably successful. Black enlistment numbers increased significantly. War bond sales in black communities surged. Dorie Miller had become a symbol, carefully managed by the Navy, of black American patriotism and courage. But Miller himself grew increasingly frustrated with the entire spectacle. In private conversations with fellow black sailors during brief returns to duty, Miller expressed feelings he couldn't share publicly. "They parade me around like a prize horse, show me off at bond rallies, put me in front of cameras, but I'm still a messman. I proved I can fight. I proved I can operate guns. Nothing changed. They gave me a medal and sent me back to serving food." He was right. Despite the Navy Cross, despite the nationwide publicity, despite proving his capability under fire, Doris Miller remained in the messman branch. The Navy had acknowledged his individual heroism, while ensuring it didn't become a precedent for broader policy change. Other black sailors watched this carefully. They understood the message. You can be a hero, but you'll still be a messman. Individual excellence won't change the system. The Navy would acknowledge black heroism when forced to, but wouldn't allow that acknowledgement to threaten segregation. Still, something had shifted. Miller's story had become widely known throughout the Navy, especially among black sailors who saw him as proof that they deserved better. The Navy had tried to minimize his heroism, but they couldn't erase it. And that created pressure that would eventually contribute to change, although not nearly as quickly as Miller and other black sailors hoped. After his war bond tour concluded in late 1942, Dorie Miller returned to sea duty. He was promoted to Mess Attendant First Class, the Navy's acknowledgement of his service, though still within the messman branch.
In May 1943, Miller was assigned to the USS Liscum Bay, a Casablanca-class escort carrier. The Liscum Bay was a small carrier, built quickly as part of the massive American warship production program, designed to provide air support for amphibious operations. By 1943, the United States Navy had begun, very slowly, under tremendous pressure from civil rights organizations and facing critical manpower shortages, to expand opportunities for black sailors beyond the messman branch. New training programs were opening. Some specialties were cautiously integrating. The wall of absolute segregation was developing cracks. But Dorie Miller wasn't part of that expansion. Despite his Navy Cross, despite proving his capability at Pearl Harbor, despite nationwide publicity, he remained a messman. The Navy had honored him while ensuring his heroism didn't set a precedent. The USS Liscum Bay deployed to the Pacific, participating in the Gilbert Islands campaign, part of the American advance across the Central Pacific toward Japan. On November 24, 1943, the carrier was supporting the invasion of Macon Atoll. American forces had successfully landed on the island and were consolidating their position. The Liscum Bay was operating offshore, launching aircraft to support ground operations. At 0510 hours, before dawn, the Japanese submarine I-175 fired a spread of torpedoes at the American carrier formation. One torpedo struck the Liscum Bay directly in the bomb magazine, the worst possible hit location. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The bomb magazine detonated, touching off aviation fuel stores and additional ammunition. The ship was literally torn apart by internal explosions, breaking into pieces. The Liscum Bay sank in less than 30 minutes. There was no time for organized evacuation, no time to launch lifeboats, no time for anything except desperate swimmers trying to get clear of the sinking wreckage. Of 916 crew members aboard, 644 were killed, including Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix and Captain Irving D. Wiltse, making it one of the worst naval disasters of the Pacific War. Mess Attendant First Class Doris Miller was among those killed. He was 24 years old. The Navy's official announcement, released in December 1943 after confirmation of casualties, was brief and bureaucratic. Mess Attendant First Class Doris Miller, United States Navy, is missing in action and presumed dead following the sinking of USS Liscum Bay CVE-56 in the Pacific Theater on November 24, 1943. It didn't mention Pearl Harbor, didn't mention the Navy Cross, didn't mention that this was the first black sailor to receive that decoration, didn't mention his heroism or his service, just missing in action, presumed dead. The news hit black communities hard. The hero of Pearl Harbor, the symbol of black American courage and capability, was gone, dead in service to a nation that had never fully acknowledged his humanity or his worth. Black newspapers ran obituaries that told the real story. They reminded readers of December 7th. They published the full account of Miller's heroism. They noted bitterly that he died still serving as a messman, despite proving he belonged in combat roles. The Pittsburgh Courier's obituary ended with a pointed observation. America lost a hero. The Navy lost a messman. That tells you everything about how this nation values black service. For decades after World War II, Dorie Miller existed in historical memory as a footnote, an interesting anecdote about Pearl Harbor, occasionally mentioned but rarely examined in depth. The full story of what he'd accomplished and what his heroism revealed about Navy racism was downplayed in mainstream histories of the war. He appeared in some textbooks as a brief mention, sometimes not even by name, just as a black messman who manned anti-aircraft guns. But in black communities, Miller's story never died. It was passed down generation to generation as an example of black Americans serving with extraordinary distinction despite systematic exclusion. Parents told children about the messman who fought at Pearl Harbor. Teachers used his story to illustrate both black patriotism and American racism.
Civil rights activists cited him as evidence that capability had nothing to do with race.
In 2020, Acting Navy Secretary Thomas Modly announced that the Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, CVN-81, would be named USS Dorie Miller. A nuclear-powered supercarrier, one of the most powerful warships ever built, bearing the name of a messman who'd fought at Pearl Harbor. The announcement came 79 years after Miller's actions at Pearl Harbor, 77 years after his death. In 2021, historians reviewing archived Navy records made a discovery that confirmed what many had long suspected. Dorie Miller's commanding officer had recommended him for the Medal of Honor, not the Navy Cross. Lieutenant Commander Dwyer C. Johnson's original recommendation, filed in December 1941, explicitly requested the Medal of Honor. His justification cited Miller's extraordinary heroism, his initiative in manning a gun he'd never been trained on, his sustained fire throughout the attack, and his continued service helping wounded and fighting fires after the ammunition was exhausted. That recommendation had been downgraded somewhere in the approval chain. The official documentation doesn't reveal who made the decision or why, but the pattern is unmistakable. In 1942, the Navy wasn't prepared to award the Medal of Honor to a black messman, regardless of his actions. Today, there are renewed calls for Dorie Miller to receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. Advocates argue that the evidence is overwhelming, the testimony is clear, and the heroism is undeniable. The downgrade from Medal of Honor to Navy Cross was based on racism, not an objective assessment of Miller's actions. The Navy has not yet acted on these recommendations. December 7, 1941 began with Dorie Miller collecting dirty laundry from officers' quarters. It ended with him swimming away from a sinking battleship after manning anti-aircraft guns for 15 minutes of sustained combat. In between, he proved that courage, capability, and heroism had nothing to do with race. The United States Navy gave him a medal, sent him on a publicity tour, and kept him serving food for the rest of his life. He died in combat 2 years later, still a messman, still excluded from the combat roles he'd proven he could perform. His commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The Navy gave him the Navy Cross instead. 79 years later, they named an aircraft carrier after him. America moves slowly toward justice. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it takes generations. Dorie Miller fought back on December 7, 1941, with whatever weapons he could reach, despite a lifetime of being told he wasn't fit to fight. He proved them wrong in 15 minutes. We're still catching up. Mess Attendant First Class Doris Dorie Miller, 1919 to 1943. USS West Virginia, BB-48. Pearl Harbor Actions, December 7, 1941. Helped move mortally wounded Captain Benyon to safety. Manned twin .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun mount, untrained. Fired continuously for approximately 15 minutes. Assisted in evacuating wounded and fighting fires. among last crew members to abandon ship. Official recognition. Navy Cross, presented May 27, 1942. First African American to receive the Navy Cross, originally recommended for Medal of Honor, downgraded. Purple Heart, posthumous, for wounds received at Pearl Harbor. Legacy. USS Miller, FF 1099, commissioned 1973. USS Doris Miller, CVN 81, aircraft carrier. Construction began 2024. Renewed calls for Medal of Honor, ongoing. Final assignment, USS Liscombe Bay, CVE 56. Killed in action, November 24, 1943. Still serving as messmen, despite proven combat capability.